Hello and welcome back to Ask an Expert with Claire Caruso. Today with us we have Diandra Ritchie, formerly Director of EEO, Labor and Employee Relations at City Colleges of Chicago and soon to be America's Employee Relations Partner at JP Morgan Chase. Dee has a degree in philosophy from Northwestern and a JD from Chicago Kent. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me, Claire.
So with everything going on in our country right now, I wanted to take this time and utilize my platform to learn a little bit more about how corporate America can advocate for people of color. So I'm just going to jump right in because you're the expert. If we could start by discussing some of the differences and similarities and perhaps definitions of EEO, diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action, what those mean for everybody in corporate America.
Sure. I guess I'll start with affirmative action because I feel like that's kind of what, I feel like that's what I first think of from like the 80s and, all the lawsuits. So affirmative action is really any action that a company takes to ensure that underrepresented populations become more represented at the organization. So people, I think, initially think of racial quotas, especially in terms of education and, having students, but it's not just quotas. It can be things like implementing a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. So diversity, equity, and inclusion are really sort of like ideas that need to be implemented through policies like affirmative action. So diversity focuses on really diversifying the types of people that we have in our corporation from all sorts of backgrounds, whether that's racial, gender identity, socioeconomic, where you're from, just geographically, religion, your ability level, foreign language, it really covers the gamut. So that's kind of diversity. Inclusion is more about a person actually feeling included in the environment that they're in. So you could have an environment where everybody looks like United Colors of Benetton, but if some of those individuals aren't really feeling like they can contribute, like they're seen and heard and valued, then they don't feel included. And so that is really what inclusion gets to, is having everyone feel like they're a valued member. And then equity, which is distinct from equality, because we're not trying to get everyone equal, because equity understands that we're not all on the exact same level. But equity seeks to bring a fairness to the equation so that where people have bumps in the road that have not allowed them to progress as much, that we work on those bumps so that everyone's road is as smooth as possible to get to where they want to go. So that's sort of diversity, equity, inclusion in a shell. EEO is really equal employment opportunity and is, federal, state, local, as well as corporate policies that protect protected categories such as race, gender, marital status, whether you're a veteran, things like that. But then, of course, there are things like gender identity that are not yet protected at the federal level. But for example, in Chicago, we do have protections for gender identity. So EEO is really about the law that protects the protected categories. Affirmative action is what an organization might do to try and implement more of getting a wider representation of the population. And then DEI, like I said, diversity, equity, inclusion, are the principles that are enacted in affirmative action policies.
Okay, thank you. That was a good way to paint that, because I think sometimes people hear these different terms and they're not exactly sure which one falls under what umbrella or what do these mean specifically. So I appreciate that clarification.
Sure.
So in terms of like the role of an EEO officer, could you go into a little bit of that?
Sure. So I was doing that for a little over 2 years at my previous position. And basically what an EEO officer does is sort of intake any kind of complaints about discrimination or harassment, because EEO also includes Title IX, which includes sexual harassment. So again, any type of discrimination or harassment or retaliation based on making a complaint of discrimination or harassment is really the purview of the EEO officer. And so typically the EEO officer will take in those complaints, review them to determine whether or not they actually are EEO. So for example, if people make a complaint, I don't think my boss likes me because I'm wearing a plaid shirt. Well, that's not EEO because wearing a plaid shirt is not a protected category. If you say that my boss didn't promote me because I am transgender, then you've got an EEO issue. So typically the EEO officer will review those complaints, perform the investigation, and then determine whether there's either been a policy violation, or for example, if you're at the EEOC, you would determine whether there's been a violation of the federal laws.
Okay. Okay. And then in terms of employee relations, so we'll kind of segue between some of your past and some of your future in terms of career-wise. What does employee relations entail?
Employee relations is kind of more that HR-y feel-good stuff that I think about. It's really running the gamut on sort of managing employees well, both how they relate to each other, how they relate to management, how they relate within the corporate structure. And I think it really speaks to just kind of make sure that managers are managing well, that employees are aware of policies and are doing what they're supposed to do, and ensuring that no policies like discrimination or harassment policies are being violated. Employee relations is a really wide umbrella. A lot of it can be very conduct specific. That's kind of more of what I've done, is the workplace investigations, and then determining what needs to happen as a result of a policy violation, whether that's training or discipline. So employee relations is very broad and sort of can encompass all of those things like EEO and DEI initiatives. But yeah, it's a very broad umbrella under human resources in any corporation.
Okay. So what steps can business owners do right now and going forward in order to properly implement or round out effective DEI programs? So, maybe you're a public company and you likely have something like that. If you're a private company, there's a lot less regimen around there. What are some ideas and recommendations that you have in terms of steps people can proactively take for business owners?
Well, you'd be surprised, because I assumed that higher education would automatically have DEI officer and office, well stated policies. And I have come to find out from personal experience, as well as talking with other people, that higher education is actually quite behind. Say like law firms, for example, I don't know if it's because the pressure isn't there, because you don't have a client saying, I need to see this information, or I'm taking my business elsewhere. But sometimes I feel like, especially in the public sector, you look around and it looks very visually diverse. And so sometimes I think people don't think there's a problem because it doesn't look like there's a problem. But then that's just it. You kind of got to get in and figure out whether there is. So as to what I think companies can start doing to kind of look at DEI initiatives and how to implement them or see whether they're working is, first you have to assess where you are, as far as what you're seeing. Are there immediate issues that you're seeing? If not, you probably want to dig deeper. And that could be something like an anonymous survey that you send to your employees.
Okay.
Because a lot of times, and again, coming from a private law firm environment to my last position, I was so excited to see the just diversity of everyone, of age, of race, of gender, just at all different levels. And it just looks, again, like the United Colors of Benetton. It seems like everyone should be holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But then as someone doing EEO work, and you start noticing there's trends with people complaining about racial incidents, there are issues, you have to start looking into those. And so I had the idea of, let's do a diversity survey and send it out to the staff and see how they're feeling, because there were a lot of complaints. And you get real surprised at the comments that that you get, both with people talking about how unvalued they feel, about how they feel like their bosses don't care about their upward mobility, or their progression. And then you have people saying stuff like, oh, well, thanks to diversity and inclusion, we've got uneducated Black people working. I mean, that as a statement doesn't even make sense. Diversity and inclusion is an idea. So I don't know how the idea translates into someone coming in who's unqualified. Furthermore, I don't know how that person would know how someone else is unqualified. But as you can see, people are using language that they don't know. And that language comes packed with these opinions and judgments that really aren't solidified in any kind of fact. Looking at some of the comments that I saw, the one time I did do a diversity survey, I was very disheartened, because you are reading these anonymous comments and it's like gut punch after gut punch, you know, and you're like, it's 2019, what's going on? But what I started to realize is a lot of the statements that you're seeing, they're just not educated statements. And you got people in higher education making these statements. So then it really struck me that training is got to be important. So I think the first thing, you've got to assess where you are, and you've got to assess how people are feeling. Then I think the next best thing is training, because if you don't educate people, you can't change their minds or their perspective. And people a lot of times don't really know what diversity, equity, and inclusion is, or they just think affirmative action means reverse racism against white people, you know, which is a whole other episode for Ask an Expert. But I think the thing is if we can all just educate ourselves and get on the same page, that's going to make the conversation that much better. And so I even thought about doing things like focus groups. You know, if you have a big corporation and you kind of get some of these different themes from these surveys to like dig down deeper, because we all know in work environments, we all complain amongst ourselves about the issues, but very few of us take it up to the person who can actually make the change. And so that's why I think the anonymous surveys are really where you're going to get the crux of what you need, because just a visual glance, or just, you know, putting your finger on the pulse of your organization isn't going to tell you what's really happening, you know? So I think it's like a listen, figure out what's going on, train. And then you kind of have to like take it from there.
Okay, and I like that too, touching on one, assessment, and I love anonymous surveys in general, just because people will tell you exactly what's on their mind, sometimes shockingly so. And then teaching, and also understanding, making sure we all have the same language and the same understanding of what everything means, so that way you can have a more constructive conversation. What are some of the main themes once you actually get in and you're starting to teach in that setting? And I know you've had a wide variety of experiences with that. What are some of the main themes you teach in order to try to get people to expand their perspective?
You know, I think when it comes to trying to teach on something like race, I always, you know, I mean, maybe it'd be kind of interesting to start with a little bit of my background. You know, I'm biracial. My mother is Black. My father is white and Cuban. I didn't really grow up with my dad's side of the family. I only grew up with my mom's side of the family. So I very much identify as a Black woman. And, you know, people pretty much pass me as white. I mean, I've literally told people to their face that I'm Black, and they will tell me to my face, I'm not accepting that you're Black. You're not Black to me. Or people using the N-word. And then I'm like, you're talking about me. And they're like, no, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about, and it's like, okay, I don't even know what to do with that. So a lot of my perspective is, first of all, even I realize I have a privilege. It's called light skin privilege. You know, I move around in this world very differently from the way my mother does, or the way my grandmother does. And at first I didn't realize that, you know, growing up, you know, my mom would always kind of tell me, you know, you have to work twice as hard. You have to be twice as good, you know, because you're a woman and you're Black. And none of that made sense. As I'm older, I can see why she's saying that. But I just wish she had explained it, because as a young child, you just don't get it. Or the basic thing, you know, when we were growing up, you can only check one box. Okay, you didn't get multiple boxes. First it was one box, then they got nice and gave us the other box. Okay, so I had to pick one, then I could be other. Then it was multiracial, but you didn't get to choose which races. And now you can choose as many boxes as you want. But I think growing up growing up in the 80s, you really did have to choose. People were not really like, I'm biracial. You really did kind of say, I'm either this or I'm that. And so I think that structured a lot of my view. Now, these days, biracial people, there's so much more interracial marriage and there's so many more biracial people. It's just not that big of a deal. And so now I've become a little more comfortable saying I'm biracial, though it still feels a little wrong. I don't know why, but I just think that I had a lot of anger growing up because people didn't understand. And then I got to a point where it was like, okay, don't get angry, let's educate. But then when I was younger, I would educate while also sort of ignoring the bad behavior that was going on. Like, oh, I'm just going to ignore that my friend just used the N-word and just remind him that my mother's Black, And then, and I think like for Black people, it's almost like grieving. I think you have an anger, you have a sadness, you have a numbness about all this. As I've gotten older, I've moved to the let's make this a teaching lesson groove. And I want to stay there. And to answer your question, I know I just went a long way around it, but I think the best thing to do is to come from a place of curiosity. Because if I walk into that training and someone says something ignorant and I'm ready to just come at them, we're already both defensive. So what I try and do is when I'm in trainings and someone says something that is really ignorant, first my mother says, control your face, so I don't roll my eyes or make a you're stupid face. And then I say things like, what makes you say that? And it's like this weird trick I learned from my mom. She told me, many, many years ago, she was in the office riding the elevator down with this attorney that she worked in the office with. My mom was a paralegal. And the attorney was saying, oh, are those Russell's children? The attorney that my mom worked for. She's like, because the children looked biracial. And my mom said, oh, I guess those are his children. And then the woman asked my mom, oh, is that Russell's wife talking about a white woman? And my mom said, oh, I'm not sure. And then the lawyer says, oh, she doesn't look like the type of woman who would marry a Black man. Do you know what a woman looks like who would marry a Black man? I don't. Now, my mom told me this story. I'm like ready to, go into her office and exchange words. My mom says she just said, oh, well, what does a woman look like who marries a Black man? And I was like, oh, I didn't mean it like that. You know what I find when you come with curiosity to people and you ask them to explain what they just said, rarely can they do it. And then I think they see, maybe something's not right here. Now, some people get really mad. Some people will engage. But I think it's the asking the questions, right? Because yes, it's a teachable moment, but you're going to get more if you can teach yourself in this moment than if I'm sitting here doing this. And to me, that's where the curiosity comes in, and asking the questions. It's getting that person to think. Like, for example, when I saw that one thing about diversity and inclusion is bringing in all these unqualified Black people, I wish I knew who that person was, because I'm like, who are these people and how do you know they're unqualified? What does this have to do with diversity and inclusion? But I think it's really coming from an open place, because if you're defensive, you can't get anywhere. You kind of have to like be the bigger person.
Absolutely. I appreciate you. That was actually one of my questions, and I really appreciate you sharing what you've observed over your life from your unique perspective and how you present in the world. So I think that informs a lot of people, and I appreciate you sharing that, and then extending on to how can that expand other people's perspective. Because with me, I feel like I've been listening and reading and trying to absorb and understand and and empathize how I can over these past couple of weeks with everything being highlighted. And I'm acknowledging that I've not been a racist person my entire life, but maybe I might not be doing enough, or I might have been ignorant in a lot of the things I've done or ways that I've thought, and I've tried to expand that perspective. I'm a curious person by nature, so I'm grateful for that, and I feel like I have a big heart. So I'm not, I'm coming from a place of not hatred to begin with, but also, figuring out and listening, what is this like for somebody who's completely different? How, I'm going to walk down the street my whole life as a white woman. That's what I'm going to understand and I'm going to know. And being a woman obviously comes with, you know, a whole own other set of things. That's a whole different conversation. But being a person of color is something completely different. So I think listening to people that you know in your own life, like what have your experiences been? And I like one of the conversations that's been happening lately, because sometimes I feel like white people are like, I don't know what to say, and I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I really don't know. I'm curious, and then should I ask? Should I not ask? I'm reading all these different opinions from people. And I think if you're coming from a place out of curiosity and you genuinely just want to learn, you're going to make mistakes, but I think you're going to make progress. And I think people will see that, you know, that you're coming from that perspective. So thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, it's definitely eye-opening. I've obviously known you for years, and, you know, I've heard some of these stories and I was like, oh, wow. Definitely eye-opening. So I appreciate you sharing those.
Yeah, of course.
How do you deal? And I think that this is going to be something that corporate America has to deal with as well. When you touched on a little bit, you've got these anonymous surveys and you have white people who may feel attacked or say this is reverse racism. And how do you disseminate or just present the information in a way that doesn't make them feel attacked or get to the core of why they might feel attacked? How do you deal with that type of a situation?
I think, I mean, for me, like in most of my formal work training, I kind of haven't had too much of that. Oddly enough, most of the training people push back on was the sexual harassment training. Go figure. You know, the only thing I can come to is, other than having a conversation, is really just connecting with someone. And I think one of the reasons I've always known that I kind of was going to be involved in race stuff, I've always felt this way ever since around high school. Probably because every day of my life, people would always say, what are you mixed with? Or so everyone just made my race a thing. Before I even knew it was a thing, it was made a thing. And then I remember getting to college and, you know, freshman year, sitting at the cafeteria, and I was saying something, I referenced my mom being Black, and literally this guy from Kentucky dropped his fork and was like, Dave, you're Black? And if it wasn't so shocking, I wouldn't be laughing. But I mean, this guy head was messed up at the idea that I was Black. And I'm telling you, I've seen it with other people. I've been in training saying, as a Black woman, you see people's face. You know, and it's like, okay, can we all just get on the same page? First of all, we're talking about melanin content, okay? Like literally. And also, it's ridiculous. I mean, Black people are so mixed anyway. I mean, none of us is pure just by virtue of our history. And we come in all shades, everyone. I don't know why this is like some epiphany, you know? It's like there are some of us that are very light and there are some of us that are very dark, and we just are in the range. But when people say stuff like that, you really begin to understand that they have a fixed idea of what Black is, what Black looks like, what it sounds like, what it's supposed to be. Because some people would say, oh, you know, Diandra, you're really smart for a Black girl. Okay, like you don't even realize, you think you're giving me a compliment. Really, you just insulted like an entire race of people. But it's like they don't even understand. So I think if you can't connect with someone or get it personal to them, so that's what I feel like has been my stance, is I've sort of tried to tell personal stories so people understand, you know, my stories are very different because I'm not walking around as a person who, what I would say, you know, reads Black or is presenting as Black to almost everyone. I'd say some people know that I'm biracial, but a lot of people just think I'm white and just pass me off. But I think that when you start challenging them, like when they say, oh, Dee, you know, you're not Black. And I say, well, what do you mean by that? You know, or then you hear the stories, oh, well, I don't like Black people because I got mugged once. Okay. You know, it's just like nobody has a really good explanation. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but nobody has a good explanation for why they don't like a certain group of people. Like it sort of thinks they make sense to them, but it kind of doesn't. But I think if you can get a personal story to them, you know, or like when I talk to them about my experiences, I feel like I can see the wheels turning and I can see that they're thinking, oh, maybe I should think about this a little differently. And again, that's the whole, like, nobody wants this, but if I can say, like, here's a personal story, here's how racism has impacted me and my family, here have been my experiences, it just gets them to think about it a little differently. Maybe they're still a little angry, they're probably still, a little rough around the edges when it comes to racial stuff. But if I can just plant a little seedling for you to think just a little differently, we're on our way. We're on our way, as opposed to just trying to talk to each other through a wall. So when people get angry and when they say ignorant stuff, do I feel a fire inside? And sometimes do I have a visceral reaction? Yes. But at the end of the day, what is that going to accomplish? And I think that's just what I keep reminding myself. And that's why, for me, I tell my stories, is because I think people can see I'm passionate about it. And I just feel like it's a way for us to connect. And I think the connection is what's going to help bring this along, right? Like, think about all these previous decades. I feel like it's always been very, us versus them, right? Black versus white. I remember growing up even being told, you don't talk to white people about stuff like race, like, oh, we save it for over here. But think about what that's done. That has kind of created a situation where a lot of white people don't know what's going on or how we're feeling. And even though it's so obvious to us, which I think sometimes people think should be obvious to white people, I think it's clear that it's not. So it's like we've kind of been two ships passing in the night. Maybe this is the point where the ships can kind of try to meet. But there's just a whole lot of work to be done. And you know what? I like that you said we're all going to make mistakes, because we are. Do you know that I didn't even realize that I had a privilege or light skin privilege until a few years ago? I had a Black friend of mine who was like, you're basically walking around with white woman privilege. And I was insulted. I almost threw him out of my house. And then I thought, okay, wait, if this is really, now see, this is what people should do, but this is hard. If this is sparking such a nerve in me, then maybe he's touched on something that I need to really think about. And then I think that's when it really dawned on me, wow, I kind of am walking around with white woman privilege. Like, 'cause I can scream I'm Black all day long, but I can pretty much walk in this world like a white woman. And that was a really hard pill for me to swallow. I don't know why. So I'm just saying, even I had to become cognizant of a privilege, and it hurt, and I had a lot of negative reaction. But I think ultimately you got to get past that stuff to like make the ultimate changes that we need, because it's all uncomfortable for everyone.
Well, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sharing your stories and having this mindset that you have to this day, because I feel like it is so productive and it's really helpful for everyone. And I appreciate it. I think I'd like to close with, you know, anybody watching, do you have any advice on, how I guess we can make the world a better place today going forward? I mean, I guess we've touched on it quite a bit in terms of just conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think for starters, educate yourself. I'm not going to get on here and tell you the books to read, because I think, frankly, you should go make the effort. But I just went online before this interview just to go see. And guess what? There are several curated lists for you to go find. Business Insider just posted 18 books talking about privilege and, history on racial oppression, 18 books you can read. There's lists out there. Let's start by educating ourselves, like we were talking about, so we can be on the same page. I know for some people, they don't understand, maybe why Black people have some of the reactions that they do. But the thing that I try to remind people is that this is not happening in a vacuum. Okay, this is hundreds of years of history. Plus, you got quarantine. We've been cooped up for months to boot. I mean, this is a keg of gunpowder just waiting to explode. So I guess I'm always a little concerned when people act like this came out of nowhere. So I'm like, really? But, so maybe let's try to understand where different segments of the population, have endured hardships. And let's just start by educating ourselves. I think the more knowledge you can bring to a conversation, the less defensive you're going to be and the more open you're going to be. See, it's that defensiveness that keeps us from getting anywhere. That's where the curiosity and the education and things like that are going to make this a possibility.
Educate yourself and be curious. I love it.
Yeah.
Dee, thank you so much for joining me today. I know this has been beneficial for everyone else. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.